At the end of the 19th century, as the United States was still learning how to breathe in the rhythm of industrial expansion, one family name echoed through steel workshops, battlefields, and the mythology of the American frontier: Winchester. To the public of the era, the name represented mechanical genius, progress, and the triumph of modern industry. It was spoken with admiration, often with pride. Yet behind that polished reputation existed a far quieter story, one shaped not by innovation alone, but by loss, unresolved inheritance, and a legacy whose moral weight could not be easily carried. This story does not begin with a house. It begins with a weapon. When Oliver Winchester took control of a struggling firearms business in the mid-19th century, he could not have foreseen the scale of influence his decision would unleash. Through innovation and relentless refinement, the repeating rifle bearing his name transformed modern warfare and frontier life alike. The success of the Winchester Repeating Arms Company reshaped the economics of conflict and settlement, providing firearms that were faster, more reliable, and devastatingly effective. Winchester rifles appeared in the American Civil War, in westward expansion, and in countless encounters that defined the nation's violent growth. They became known, famously, as the gun that won the West. But progress left shadows in its wake. Every rifle sold carried with it an unspoken tally: lives ended, families broken, histories redirected. While the company's profits soared, the human cost remained invisible in balance sheets and annual reports, buried beneath the language of innovation and demand. The wealth generated by this empire passed down to Oliver Winchester's son, William Wirt Winchester, a man who inherited power and responsibility, but not the robust health required to enjoy either. William married Sarah Winchester, a reserved and educated woman from a respected New England family. Their life together, outwardly comfortable and secure, was soon marked by tragedy. Their only child died in infancy, a loss that left no public record of grief, but shaped everything that followed. Years later, William himself succumbed to tuberculosis, leaving Sarah a widow before middle age. In a single stroke, Sarah Winchester became one of the wealthiest women in America. She inherited not only a vast fortune, but a perpetual stream of income from Winchester Company, shares in income so immense that it bordered on the abstract. Yet money did not shield her from isolation. Instead, it intensified it. She was left alone with grief that had no social language, and with a legacy inseparable from mass death. In the rigid social world of the late 19th century, wealthy widows were expected to remarry, retreat into polite philanthropy, or fade gracefully into managed obscurity. Sarah Winchester did none of these things. Instead, she withdrew from the public eye and eventually made a decisive break from the East Coast elite. In 1886, she traveled west and purchased a modest farmhouse near San Jose, then a quiet agricultural region far removed from the industrial centers that had produced her fortune. At first, the property was unremarkable. It bore no sign of the architectural phenomenon it would become. But over time, the house began to grow. And then it refused to stop. What would later be known as the Winchester Mystery House expanded continuously for decades. Rooms were added, altered, demolished, and rebuilt without a fixed master plan. Construction never fully ceased during Sarah Winchester's lifetime. Workers followed instructions delivered incrementally, often without understanding the larger purpose of their labor. There were no preserved blueprints, no definitive architectural vision that explained the house's direction, or lack of one. Gradually, the structure took on qualities that defied conventional logic. Staircases ascended into ceilings. Doors opened onto walls. Windows looked inward or onto empty space. Hallways narrowed, twisted, or terminated abruptly. From the outside, the house appeared sprawling and unstable, as though it were in a constant state of becoming, never allowed to resolve into completion. Later generations would frame these features as evidence of madness or superstition. Popular accounts claimed Sarah Winchester believed she was haunted by the spirits of those killed by Winchester rifles, and that constant construction was meant to appease them. These stories, while compelling, rely more on myth than documentation. Serious historical research paints a more restrained, more human portrait. What can be confirmed through property records, contemporary accounts, and surviving correspondence is that Sarah Winchester exercised extraordinary personal control over her home. At a time when women rarely directed large-scale building projects, she made countless architectural decisions herself. She experimented with design, embraced new technologies, and reshaped the house repeatedly. Construction for her was not merely functional. It was continuous movement, an act that resisted finality. In this light, the house becomes less a monument to superstition and more a physical manifestation of unresolved grief and unlimited means. With no financial constraint forcing closure, there was no natural endpoint. Each addition postponed stillness. Each renovation deferred silence. As America celebrated efficiency, expansion, and mastery over space, the Winchester house stood apart as an anomaly. It did not optimize. It did not conclude. It turned inward, circling its own memory. It became an architectural echo of a life shaped by inheritance without guidance, wealth without relief, and loss without ritual closure. And it is here, in this contradiction between boundless resources and emotional paralysis, that the true mystery begins, not in ghosts, but in the quiet psychology of legacy itself. By the final years of the 19th century, the house on the outskirts of San Jose had crossed a threshold beyond practicality. What had begun as a private residence was slowly becoming something else, entirely an environment shaped not by necessity or social display, but by repetition, persistence, and a refusal to accept completion. Construction had become a constant presence, not a phase. Hammers sounded daily. Lumber arrived in steady rhythm. Walls rose, vanished, and rose again. In a nation intoxicated by progress, this house did not move forward in a straight line. It moved in circles. Sarah Winchester lived inside this perpetual transformation with remarkable consistency. She did not preside over the building from a distance, nor did she delegate its direction entirely to architects or contractors. Contemporary accounts describe her as attentive to detail, deeply involved in decisions that ranged from structural layout to decorative flourishes. She favored complexity over symmetry, variation over repetition. The house did not conform to a single architectural style. Instead, it absorbed many. Victorian ornamentation blended uneasily with Gothic arches, Eastlake woodwork, and emerging industrial features. The result was not harmony, but accumulation. The absence of a master plan was not an oversight. It was the defining principle. Unlike grand estates of the same era, homes, built to demonstrate lineage, control, and permanence, this structure resisted any sense of final authority. Rooms were added without clear purpose. Corridors bent away from logic. Ceiling heights shifted unexpectedly. In many cases, spaces were rendered obsolete almost as soon as they were finished. A bedroom might be sealed off by a new wall. A window might be installed only to face an interior partition erected weeks later. From a functional standpoint, these choices were wasteful. From a psychological standpoint, they suggest something else entirely. A house designed not to serve, but to continue. Workers hired to build and rebuild the mansion rarely stayed long. The work was steady and well paid, but confusing. Instructions arrived piecemeal, often late at night or early in the morning. There are no verified records of seances directing construction, despite later popular claims. What survives instead are payroll logs, supply orders, and oral histories describing an employer who was quiet, courteous, and unwavering in her insistence that the work never stop. Construction in this context was not about improvement. It was about motion. For Sarah Winchester, motion offered protection from stillness. Stillness, after all, was associated with loss. Her child's brief life had ended in silence. Her husband's death had brought a future to a sudden halt. The industrial wealth that surrounded her had no emotional language for mourning. In a society that prized restraint, grief was expected to fade discreetly. But unresolved grief does not disappear. It looks for outlets. In Sarah Winchester's case, it found one in architecture. The house became a private landscape where time could be manipulated, where beginnings did not require endings, where no room ever had to become final. By the turn of the 20th century, the structure had grown massive. Estimates suggest more than 100 rooms at its height, though the exact number remains uncertain due to constant alteration. The house spread outward and upward, creating a layered, uneven silhouette that stood apart from neighboring properties. Yet despite its size, it did not dominate the landscape in the manner of aristocratic mansions. It appeared unsettled, like a thought interrupted mid-sentence. Then, in April of 1906, nature intervened. The great earthquake that struck Northern California devastated cities across the region. San Jose suffered damage, but the epicenter's most dramatic destruction unfolded in San Francisco, where fires and collapsing buildings reshaped the urban landscape overnight. The Winchester house did not escape unscathed. Entire sections were damaged. Several upper floors collapsed inward. Towers that had once risen awkwardly above the rest of the structure were reduced to rubble. For many property owners, such destruction would have marked an end, a moment to abandon, rebuild sensibly, or retreat. For Sarah Winchester, it marked a pivot. Instead of restoring the damaged sections to their original form, she ordered them sealed off. Staircases were blocked. Rooms were closed permanently. Upper stories were removed rather than repaired. The house did not return to its previous configuration. It folded the disaster into itself, preserving damage as absence. Where the earthquake had erased space, Sarah Winchester chose not to replace it. This decision is critical to understanding the psychology of the house. The earthquake was an external force, unpredictable, uncontrollable, final. It did what no human process had done before. It forced an ending. Sarah's response was not to deny that ending, but to encase it. The sealed rooms became architectural scars, silent acknowledgments that not everything could be rebuilt. Yet construction elsewhere continued. The house adapted by growing laterally instead of vertically. New rooms extended outward. New passages formed around sealed spaces. The mansion became less a single structure than a collection of fragments, loosely connected, unevenly aligned. Moving through it required constant adjustment. Orientation was difficult. Memory was unreliable. Visitors reported disorientation, not because the house was deliberately deceptive, but because it lacked narrative order. This disorder would later become its public identity. As the years passed, journalists and local storytellers began to take notice. Rumors grew. Explanations multiplied. The more illogical the house appeared, the more irresistible supernatural interpretations became. It was far easier to attribute the mansion's complexity to ghosts than to grief. Folklore offered spectacle. Psychology required patience. But the truth, insofar as it can be reconstructed, is quieter and more unsettling. Sarah Winchester did not build to frighten spirits. She built to avoid finality. With unlimited funds and no external authority to impose restraint, her inner world spilled outward into physical space. The house became a place where control could be exercised in small increments, endlessly, without ever confronting the ultimate loss of control that death represents. By the time Sarah Winchester reached old age, the house no longer functioned as a conventional home. Large portions were unused. Others were accessible only by indirect routes. Maintenance alone required constant labor. What had once been an expression of autonomy had become a structure that demanded care simply to exist. Inheritance, in this form, was no longer empowering. It was consuming. And as Sarah Winchester moved closer to the end of her life, the house stood not as a monument to eccentricity, but as evidence of what happens when wealth removes limits without providing meaning. The question that now loomed was not why the house had been built, but what would happen to it when the one person who understood its private logic was gone. When Sarah Winchester died in September of 1922, the house fell silent for the first time in nearly 4 decades. Construction stopped not gradually, but instantly. Hammers were set down mid-task. Tools were left where they lay. What had functioned as a living process collapsed into stillness. The logic that governed the house, private, intuitive, and unrecorded, vanished with the woman who had sustained it. What remained was an immense architectural question mark. Sarah Winchester's death did not bring clarity. It created a vacuum. Her will, meticulously detailed in matters of finance and personal property, offered no philosophical explanation for the house. She left her estate to her niece, distributing furniture, art, and personal effects with precision. But the structure itself, its meaning, its intention was absent from her final words. There was no statement of purpose, no confession, no revelation to resolve decades of speculation. The house was simply there, vast and unfinished, burdened with interpretation. Within weeks, the contents of the mansion were inventoried and auctioned. Room by room, Sarah Winchester's private world was dismantled and dispersed. Objects that had once existed within her carefully controlled environment were absorbed into the marketplace. The house itself, however, resisted easy liquidation. Its unconventional design made it difficult to repurpose. It was too large to be practical, too strange to be ignored, and too expensive to demolish without consequence. That ambiguity proved decisive. Almost immediately, the house began to attract attention not as a residence, but as a curiosity. Visitors arrived not to understand its construction, but to explain it away. In the absence of authoritative answers, stories rushed in to fill the silence. Spiritualism, already popular in late 19th and early 20th century America, offered a ready-made framework. The idea that Sarah Winchester had been guided or tormented by spirits transformed the house from an architectural anomaly into a haunted relic. These narratives spread quickly. Newspapers amplified them. Tour guides embellished them. The complexity of grief was reduced to spectacle. A woman who had lived privately and left little behind in the way of personal testimony was posthumously rewritten as a recluse driven by fear and superstition. The house, once an inward-looking structure, was turned outward, marketed, narrated, simplified. By the 1920s, the Winchester House had reopened to the public as a tourist attraction. Its new identity was carefully curated. Staircases to nowhere became spirit traps. Sealed rooms became evidence of panic. Repetition was rebranded as obsession. The mansion's illogic, which once reflected a personal internal order, was reframed as madness. What was lost in this transformation was proportion. Historical records do not support the more sensational claims. There is no credible documentation of seances directing construction. No surviving testimony confirms that Sarah Winchester believed herself haunted. The myths persisted not because they were true, but because they were profitable and because they offered a narrative more comfortable than the alternative. It is easier to believe in ghosts than to confront the long-term psychological cost of unexamined wealth and unprocessed grief. As the decades passed, the house became an object of entertainment rather than inquiry. Its story was told and retold in simplified form, gradually drifting further from verifiable history. The mansion appeared in popular books, radio programs, and eventually film. Each retelling sharpened the supernatural elements and dulled the human ones. Sarah Winchester's voice, already absent, was overwritten by collective imagination. Yet the physical structure resisted complete distortion. Despite restoration efforts and safety modifications, the house retained its fundamental character: asymmetrical, layered, unresolved. Visitors walking its corridors experienced something deeper than fear. Many reported confusion, fatigue, and a subtle emotional dislocation. The house did not terrify so much as unsettle. It lacked the theatrical cues of conventional haunted spaces. Its power came from its refusal to guide, to conclude, to reassure. In this way, the house continued to tell the truth quietly. The Winchester Mystery House does not function as a puzzle waiting to be solved. It is not a riddle with a hidden answer. It is a record of process without resolution, an inheritance allowed to expand without constraint, a life lived with unlimited means and limited emotional closure. The house does not point outward toward spirits. It points inward, toward the psychology of accumulation. By mid-century, preservationists and historians began pushing back against the more exaggerated legends. Scholarly reassessments reframed Sarah Winchester, not as an eccentric victim of superstition, but as a woman operating within and pushing against the limitations of her era. Architecture, in this interpretation, was not a response to fear, but an assertion of agency in a world that offered few acceptable outlets for female autonomy. Still, myth proved resilient. The house survived because it balanced two identities, a historical artifact and a commercial narrative. This duality ensured its preservation, but also guaranteed its misinterpretation. The public rarely came seeking nuance. They came seeking mystery. And mystery, once monetized, resists correction. As time moved forward, the house took on a broader symbolic role. It became a cautionary structure not about ghosts, but about inheritance. About what happens when wealth outpaces wisdom. When resources remove limits without providing meaning. When motion replaces mourning, and building replaces understanding. By the end of the 20th century, the Winchester Mystery House stood not merely as a tourist destination, but as a cultural mirror. It reflected America's long-standing discomfort with excess, death, and responsibility. A nation built on expansion struggled to interpret a building that expanded without purpose. A culture fascinated by success avoided confronting its emotional cost. And so the house remained visited, photographed, narrated, yet still fundamentally misunderstood. The final question was no longer whether the house was haunted, but whether its true story had ever been told honestly at all. By the early 21st century, the Winchester Mystery House had outlived every person who had known Sarah Winchester personally. The living memory was gone. What remained was structure: wood, glass, staircases, and absence standing in for a woman whose intentions were never formally recorded. In this absence, interpretation hardened into habit. The house was no longer simply a site of curiosity. It had become a verdict passed down by repetition. Each retelling fixed its meaning a little more firmly, even as the original evidence faded further from reach. Yet architecture does not lie easily. Unlike written myths, buildings retain contradictions. They preserve inefficiencies. They resist simplification. The Winchester House, when examined carefully, does not behave like a monument to fear. It behaves like a system without breaks. Its defining feature is not terror, but continuation. There is no single axis, no ceremonial center, no symbolic climax. Instead, there is perpetual adjacency: rooms added beside rooms, corridors skirting around sealed spaces, structures adapting around damage rather than correcting it. The house never asserts dominance over its environment. It merely persists. This persistence reframes the story entirely. When historians and architectural scholars began reassessing the mansion without the overlay of supernatural folklore, a different narrative emerged, one less sensational, but far more unsettling. Sarah Winchester's house is not a reaction to ghosts. It is a reaction to inheritance itself. The wealth she controlled was not earned by her, nor shaped by her values. It arrived fully formed, already bound to violence, already normalized by society. With no cultural framework to help her process that burden, she translated it into form. The house became a method of containment. Every addition absorbed money that might otherwise have demanded moral explanation. Every alteration converted abstract wealth into physical labor. The constant employment of workers, the relentless purchase of materials, the refusal to stop these were not signs of irrationality, but of redirection. Capital flowed into space. Space replaced reckoning. In this sense, the Winchester Mystery House stands apart from other grand American homes of its era. The estates of industrialists like Carnegie or Vanderbilt were designed to project order, lineage, and authority. They declared control over time and taste. The Winchester House does the opposite. It denies hierarchy. It refuses coherence. It reveals what happens when control exists without purpose. This is why the house feels disorienting rather than majestic. Visitors often describe a subtle exhaustion after walking its corridors, a sense of effort without reward. That sensation is not accidental. The building mirrors the psychological state that produced it: motion without arrival, accumulation without resolution. The house does not invite awe. It invites reflection, even if unintentionally. It asks what happens when mourning is deferred indefinitely. When wealth insulates a person not only from hardship, but from closure. As preservation efforts increased, curators faced a paradox. To maintain the house as a tourist site required freezing it in time, selecting which version of an ever-changing structure would be presented as authentic. In doing so, they imposed finality on a place defined by its resistance to endings. Restoration stabilized staircases that were never meant to stabilize. Safety railings introduced boundaries where none had existed. Interpretation panels provided explanations where Sarah Winchester had offered none. The house survived, but at the cost of ambiguity. Still, beneath the curated narrative, the deeper truth remained accessible to those willing to look slowly. The Winchester Mystery House is not a warning about superstition. It is a warning about excess without meaning. About inheritance that arrives detached from responsibility. About the cultural tendency to mythologize discomfort rather than analyze it. Sarah Winchester did not leave behind a manifesto. She left behind a process. And processes, unlike stories, do not resolve neatly. They linger. They demand interpretation across generations. The house has endured precisely because it does not conclude. It continues to unsettle because it reflects a question America has never fully answered. What should be done with wealth once it has outgrown human scale? The house offers no answer. It only shows the consequences of avoiding the question. And so, long after the myths have been told and retold, the Winchester Mystery House stands as a quiet judgment, not on Sarah Winchester herself, but on a society that preferred ghosts to grief, legend to responsibility, and spectacle to understanding. In the end, the Winchester Mystery House does not ask to be solved. It asks to be endured. Long after the last tour group leaves, after the interpretive lights dim and the scripted explanations fall silent, the house returns to its most honest state: stillness, layered atop decades of motion. It does not feel abandoned in the conventional sense. It feels paused, as if the act that once animated it, building, might resume at any moment, should the will that drove it return. This suspended quality is what separates the house from ruins. Ruins speak of collapse. The Winchester House speaks of interruption. What endures here is not architecture alone, but a pattern. The story of Sarah Winchester is often framed as singular, an oddity preserved by circumstance. Yet the deeper examination reveals something far more common. her experience inheritance without authorship. Wealth without narrative, loss without ritual is not unique. It is merely magnified. Most inheritances arrive already burdened with histories their recipients did not choose. Most societies provide mechanisms to distribute wealth, but few provide language to process its moral weight. In this absence, people improvise. Some build institutions. Some seek absolution. Some, like Sarah Winchester, build space. The house stands as a physical improvisation. Its continued preservation reflects a collective unease. We are drawn to the structure not because it frightens us, but because it mirrors unresolved tensions we recognize instinctively. We sense that the house is excessive, yet we hesitate to condemn it. We feel that it is wasteful, yet we cannot look away. It embodies a contradiction at the heart of modern prosperity, the capacity to create endlessly, without necessarily understanding why. This is why the supernatural myth never fully disappears. Ghosts provide closure where history does not. They offer agency to the dead, intention to randomness, morality to accident. By attributing the house to hauntings, society absolves itself from examining the systems that made such a structure possible. The myth relocates responsibility away from industry, inheritance, and social silence, and places it safely in the realm of fantasy. But the house itself resists that relocation. Its materials are ordinary. Its methods are documented. Its timeline is consistent with income and access. There is nothing in its physical record that requires the supernatural to explain it. What it requires instead is patience, the willingness to sit with ambiguity, and to accept that not all human behavior resolves into neat motivations. Sarah Winchester never offered an explanation, because perhaps she did not possess one that could be spoken. Her actions suggest not madness but persistence. Not fear but avoidance. Not belief in ghosts, but a refusal to stop moving. In a life where death had arrived without warning, and wealth had arrived without effort, motion may have been the only remaining proof of agency. When viewed this way, the Winchester Mystery House becomes less an eccentric relic and more a cautionary structure. It warns of what happens when resources remove natural endings. When nothing forces a conclusion, processes can continue long after they have lost purpose. The house was not designed to last forever. It simply was never required to stop. This is its quiet lesson. In a world increasingly defined by accumulation of wealth, data, influence, expansion, the Winchester House feels unexpectedly contemporary. It asks whether growth alone can ever substitute for meaning. Whether activity can replace understanding. Whether building, in the absence of reflection, leads anywhere at all. The house still stands because we still recognize ourselves in it. Not in its staircases to nowhere, but in its refusal to finish. In its uneasy relationship with excess. In its transformation of private coping into public spectacle. We visit it not to confront Sarah Winchester's ghosts, but to glimpse our own unanswered questions, reflected back in wood and glass. And perhaps that is why the house endures, not as a mystery to be solved, but as a mirror that cannot be covered. There is a moment, often unnoticed, when the Winchester Mystery House ceases to function as a destination and becomes something else entirely. It happens not during the guided tour, nor at the climax of a ghost story, but afterward when visitors step back into daylight carrying a faint, unsettled quiet with them. The house does not chase. It does not linger theatrically. It releases people slowly, leaving behind a residue of thought rather than fear. That residue is its final work. In the years since its preservation, the house has been stabilized, interpreted, categorized, and protected. Its staircases are secured, its hazards labeled, its narrative rehearsed. These interventions were necessary. Without them, the structure would not have survived. Yet preservation also imposes a subtle violence of its own. To preserve is to choose. To choose is to simplify. And simplification, no matter how careful, risks losing the one quality that made the house honest in the first place, its refusal to explain itself. What remains, after all explanations are exhausted, is a record of time spent building rather than speaking. Sarah Winchester did not write memoirs. She did not give interviews. She did not defend her choices. Her legacy is spatial, not verbal. It exists in layers rather than arguments. And because of this, it resists moral verdicts. The house does not ask us to pity her, nor to condemn her. It does not even ask us to understand her fully. It asks something more difficult, to recognize how easily extraordinary resources can isolate a person from resolution. The Winchester Mystery House stands today because no one ever decided it was finished. That alone sets it apart from almost every other historic structure. Most buildings are born of intent and completed by necessity. This one was born of continuation. Its ending arrived not by design, but by mortality. When the builder died, the process ended not because it had reached its purpose, but because it had lost its driver. This distinction matters. In that sense, the house is not unfinished. It is interrupted. And interruption, unlike incompletion, implies that something was never meant to conclude. That quality is what continues to resonate. We live in an age that prizes growth, continuity, and scalability. Systems are designed to persist. Projects expand. Wealth compounds. Yet we rarely ask who bears the cost of endless continuation when there is no moment for reflection. The Winchester House is the physical consequence of never asking that question. It endures not because it is mysterious, but because it is familiar. Because it shows how human grief can be stretched thin across decades when no cultural structure exists to contain it. Because it demonstrates how money, when detached from purpose, can become a solvent rather than a solution, dissolving boundaries, endings, and meaning alike. The house will continue to be visited. The myths will continue to circulate. That is inevitable. But beneath every retelling, the structure itself remains unchanged in its deeper message. It does not whisper of ghosts. It speaks, quietly and relentlessly, of accumulation without reckoning. And perhaps that is why the Winchester Mystery House refuses to fade into novelty. Long after the last fact is learned, the last rumor dismissed, the last tour completed, the house remains. It stands as a reminder that not all inheritances are gifts. Not all building is progress, and not all motion leads forward. Some structures are not meant to be understood completely. They are meant to be recognized. This is perhaps the most unsettling truth about the Winchester Mystery House. Long after the final narration fades, after the historical arguments are laid out, and the myths are carefully dismantled, the structure stands exactly where it has always stood. It does not acknowledge resolution. It does not signal closure. It does not adapt itself to the conclusions we reach about it. It simply continues to exist, indifferent to interpretation. This endurance exposes a fundamental tension between history and architecture. History seeks meaning. Architecture preserves consequence. The Winchester Mystery House does not correct misunderstanding. It does not defend Sarah Winchester's intentions, nor does it refute the legends projected onto her life. It allows every generation to impose its own framework, knowing that frameworks are temporary. What survives is the physical record of choices made repeatedly, quietly, and without final explanation. In this way, the house becomes an archive of silence. There are no inscriptions carved into its walls announcing purpose. No grand central space that declares authority or triumph. Instead, the house is composed of margins, transitional spaces, secondary staircases, leftover corridors, rooms without names. It is built almost entirely out of what most architecture treats as afterthought. This alone makes it radical. The Winchester House privileges process over product, continuation over conclusion. That quality places it in conflict with how modern audiences are taught to consume history. We expect stories to end. We expect lessons to resolve. We expect buildings to symbolize something clear. The Winchester Mystery House refuses all three. It does not teach through clarity, but through endurance. It asks viewers not to understand Sarah Winchester fully, but to sit with the discomfort of never being able to. This discomfort is amplified by the house's transformation into heritage. Once something is preserved, it is often assumed to be resolved, to have been translated from private meaning into public consensus. But preservation does not guarantee understanding. In some cases, it freezes misunderstanding in place. The Winchester House is preserved not because it is understood, but because it resists being discarded. It survives as a contradiction that cannot be smoothed out. Sarah Winchester's life ended quietly, without public reckoning. The industrial system that produced her wealth continued uninterrupted. The firearms industry expanded. The nation moved forward. Nothing stopped. In that sense, the house did not fail. It mirrored its environment perfectly. It embodied a culture that knew how to build endlessly, but not how to stop. Seen from this angle, the Winchester Mystery House is not an anomaly. It is a concentrated expression of a broader historical pattern. The difference is scale and visibility. Most inheritances are invisible. Most grief is private. Most excess is normalized. Sarah Winchester's house simply made those forces visible in wood and glass. That visibility is why the house still matters. Not as a haunted site, not as a curiosity, but as a material question left unanswered. What responsibility accompanies inherited power? What happens when wealth removes the natural boundaries that give human lives shape? And what does society do when confronted with structures that reveal its own avoidance? The house offers no moral judgment. It does not accuse. It does not absolve. It only remains. And in remaining, it performs its final function not as a mystery to be solved, but as a silence that refuses to disappear.